Ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I'm John Miko, the president of Founding Forward, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to tonight's Civil War Roundtable. It's so great to see such a big crowd for tonight's Civil War Roundtable, and we have such great crowds for all of them. Many of you come to these programs week in and week out, year after year, and it's a wonderful opportunity for you to learn more about our great nation's history, about this great institution, the Union League of Philadelphia, and all the things that we hold so dear. It's usually at about this time, and if you've been to many of these programs, you know that I now make a pitch for support for what we do. But I have an admission of failure, that so many of you don't support what we do. And so I'm going to take a different tact, and I'm going to thank all of you who do support what we do. And it's about 40% of the people in this room, the members of the League in this room, actually support our work with a contribution. And I thank you for that. Your gifts make possible civic education for thousands of students and teachers from across the country who come to Valley Forge, our campus in Valley Forge and Lafayette Hill, and here in Philadelphia for immersive education about the rights and responsibilities of American citizenship, who learn about our founding documents, the Declaration and the Constitution, about those great liberty documents and how important they are, and that it's your job, it's our job, it's their job to make us more perfect. I thank you for your contributions that create the great art that we have, that care for the art, and allow us to share it through our docent program to thousands of, not just League members, but thousands of Philadelphians and fellow citizens from across the region. Thank you for making possible our collections care and sharing our collections, which are shared not just here in the House and used by scholars, but used by other educational organizations here in Philadelphia and across the country. Thank you for making possible our scholarship programs, which create new, better, more educated citizen leaders, which we need so desperately. I thank you for all that you do to make it possible. And I thank you for making possible tonight. Tonight is an educational program of Founding Forward. We don't charge for tonight. Most of our programs we don't charge anything for. Some we do, but they're all underwritten, at least in part, through your contributions or through some of your contributions. And I thank you if you're making a contribution. If you're not making a contribution, I hope you'll thank those that do and who have made tonight possible. So look next to you, and if you're not making a contribution, thank that person. And if you aren't making a contribution and you'd like to, it's very easy. You will receive an email tomorrow. And you just need to respond positively. And please do, if you believe in the Constitution, if you believe in the Declaration of Independence, if you believe in what we're doing to make better citizen leaders, we need your support. It won't work without you. So I thank you in advance for your support. Now to some housekeeping. Please do turn off your cell phones. We will have a Q&A at the end of our program. It will be with microphone. Please use the microphone as we are streaming, and we need to hear that on our streaming. Also, of course, as always, question, not a speech. Keep it short. I was at a program last night where the one question was as long as the speaker. We have our crack staff back there. We'll just simply cut you off. Just leave it at a couple sentences. We thank you for that. And upcoming programs. We have some really wonderful upcoming programs in the next couple of weeks. We have one on April 16th, which is on Thomas Sully. Thomas Sully is the artist that, among other things, created the wonderful Washington equestrian portrait that's in our collection. And then a public affairs program on April 22nd, military leadership in the 21st century. And then a public affairs program on May 1st, cyber threats and national security. So that'll be a wonderful program. All these, of course, you can find on our website, and please register. And I want to acknowledge just a couple of our leaders who make this possible, not just give their resources of cash, and they do that, but also their time and talent. Steve Target, who is our chair of the Education Committee. Thank you, Steve. And yes, please, a round of applause for Steve. And Paul Snitzer, who is the chair of this speaker program committee. And one last, thank you, Paul. One last person I'm going to introduce, and she's going to introduce our speaker. She is a member of the Board of Trustees of Founding Forward. She's a member of our Strategic Planning Committee. Please welcome Sue Heindel. Sue.
Thank you, John, and good evening, everyone. Dr. Jon Grinspan is Curator of Political History at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, focusing on the deep history of American democracy and how it speaks to contemporary politics. He holds a PhD and master's from the University of Virginia and a bachelor's from Sarah Lawrence College. Grinspan is the award-winning author of The Age of Acrimony: How Americans Fought to Fix Their Democracy, and The Virgin Vote: How Young Americans Made Democracy Social, Politics Personal, and Voting Popular in the 19th Century. His writing frequently appears in the New York Times and elsewhere. Grinspan's works for the Smithsonian also takes him to political events, from conventions to protests to riots, collecting materials to help teach future generations about 21st century American democracy. Founding Forward is honored to welcome Dr. Jon Grinspan.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight, for turning out for an event to learn a little history. The one detail you forgot to mention is that I'm a sixth-generation Philadelphian living in diaspora in D.C., but I'm always happy to come back, and especially after a big win. And I'll try to make this a little bit Philadelphia, bring in the local color as I can. So before I get going, by a show of hands, who's heard of the Wide Awakes? The Wide Awakes. All right, this is beautiful. I can teach you all about the Wide Awakes. None of you have to leave. In the fall of 1860, during the run-up to the 1860 presidential election, the most consequential, significant, and most important election in American history, a strange force started to show themselves in the streets of Philadelphia. They marched with torches on long staffs, with black capes that shimmered in the nighttime, and military caps in military lockstep columns, marching through Philadelphia in midnight rallies. They marched down Chestnut Street at midnight and stopped outside the Continental Hotel, the nicest hotel in Philadelphia in 1860, at Chestnut and 9th, where they shouted cheers for Abraham Lincoln, for the Republican Party, and for John Brown, and hissed and booed the Southern slave-owning guests who were staying there. They marched down Spruce Street and stopped at 13th and Spruce long enough to terrify Betty Ann Graham, a young Virginian, 15-year-old Virginia girl who was in Philadelphia for boarding school, and she believed they were coming to get her. To some people, this movement looked like a mass rising against slavery. To other people, it looked like the opening steps of a civil war. They assembled on Broad Street and attacked a rival political movement's organization, a rival rally, pouring out of a local saloon on Broad and South, throwing eggs at the speakers at this political event and shooting holes in their banners with revolvers. And they assembled in large numbers at a field in Germantown, tens of thousands of wide awakes and hundreds of thousands of spectators, to announce that they were about to elect Abraham Lincoln, bring the Republican Party to power, and finally strike a blow against slavery in America. If you stepped out into the street during one of these rallies, if you walked out of this building onto Broad Street in 1860, you might smell them first, because these torches burnt whale oil or kerosene, and they stank. And after the smell, the odor, you might hear their drums banging as they came closer to you. And then you would hear the hard soles of hard-soled boots stomping on the cobblestones up Broad Street as they got closer. Only as you could see them would you see tens of thousands of young men in military uniforms, in columns, marching in lockstep in silence, periodically calling out chants for Lincoln, for the Republican Party, and for a war against slavery. This is a year before the Civil War begins, and hundreds of thousands of Americans are marching around in uniforms, talking about war. They called themselves the Wide Awakes, and their story tells us so much about the coming of the Civil War, and yet it's been oddly forgotten. I've been studying the Wide Awakes for 18 years now. I just can't get away from these guys, and I've become convinced that they are among the largest, the strangest, the most consequential, and the most forgotten mass movements in American political history. They emerge, they shape that election, they shape secession, civil war, democracy in the 19th century, and then they disappear, and almost no one knows their story, which is a shame because they are a really useful puzzle piece for understanding so much about the coming of the Civil War. So much about the coming of the Civil War never quite made sense to me as a student. How you get from the political conflicts over slavery, over the issues of the 1850s, to Americans actually shooting Americans, the jump never quite connected. The Wide Awakes help tell this story contiguously. They're a useful puzzle piece for that reason. First of all, they help explain how Abraham Lincoln ever won election. How after years and years of anti-slavery movements failing and losing elections, even on a local level, suddenly in 1860, the Republican Party wins as an anti-slavery party. They're not necessarily abolitionists. They're not trying to end slavery tomorrow, but they want to push back against slavery in American life. That is a revolution in and of itself. And the coalition that comes together to elect Lincoln and the Republican Party is built by the Wide Awakes. They build a diverse coalition out of people who often hated each other. The second thing they do as a puzzle piece is help us connect the election and the war that follows. Because they start as a campaign organization and continue to tell the story all the way through to the first gunshots of the Civil War, we can see how a political conflict evolves into a military one, how a political campaign becomes a military campaign. You can tell the whole story. I think often when we talk about the Civil War, we talk about the election of 1860, we talk about Abe Lincoln, and then there's like a jump cut to Fort Sumter, cannons firing on Fort Sumter, and then another cut to maybe the first Battle of Bull Run. The Wide Awakes help make sense of this story as a human political conflict, which continued to escalate, continued to militarize until it left the nation at civil war with itself. The third thing they're really helpful at is exploring the line between politics and warfare. Because the Wide Awakes were militaristic, because they were militant, because they marched as an army, because they wore uniforms, gave their soldiers ranks, and used all this military rhetoric, and then they continued to operate until a war emerged. They help us explore where the line is between political rhetoric, political symbol, iconography, the things you say on a campaign, and actual fighting on the ground. They really help tease out where the line is. What is just talk? What is just symbol? What is preparing for bloodshed? The Wide Awakes are a key puzzle piece for all of those things. And yet their story hasn't been told, which I think is often why so much of the coming of the Civil War bedevils us still. The question of how we got to war in a civil, peaceful democracy. The Wide Awakes didn't cause the war, but they help us understand its coming. So what was a Wide Awake before I go any further? Wide Awakes were young, anti-slavery, militant movements that marched at night with torches to oppose the power of slavery over American life. Again, they're not necessarily abolitionists. They're not necessarily marching to end slavery tomorrow, but they feel in one way or another that slavery has too much power over something in American life. And often, it's the case that they feel that the Southern slave power, has too much power over Northerners, Northern white men, which most Wide Awakes were, not all. They're trying to rejigger the power in American society. They're a diverse movement. There are white Wide Awakes and black Wide Awakes, recent immigrants and know-nothing xenophobes. There are even a few female Wide Awakes, but somehow they come together with a shared sense that American democracy is under threat already. The war has already begun. There's a threat to American democracy, and it's coming from what they call the slave power. And it's not hard to feel that way in the 1850s and 1860s. Any of you, I'm sure many of you are Civil War buffs, and you know that the years before the Civil War, there's a mounting sense of conflict in America. And people who join the Wide Awakes will point to a number of incidents. First, there's the constant assault on democracy from slavery itself, where the 4 million enslaved people in the South who live without rights, live with brutality, live with constant theft, That's not a democracy, obviously. But slavery continues to expand in the 1850s. It's not dying. It's not going away. It's getting bigger. It's getting more wealth. It's getting more power. Slavery is expanding out of the traditional area in the South where it had lived, trying to expand into Kansas and Nebraska. Certainly it already expanded into Texas with the Fugitive Slave Act, hunting freed slaves up into the north. You see slave catchers going into Philadelphia, going into Boston, going into all sorts of northern cities to catch people. It feels as if slavery is not just something that exists in Georgia or Virginia, but that slavery is something that's imposing upon New Jersey and Massachusetts and California and Kansas. There's a sense for those people who do not own slaves that slavery is asking more and more of them. And really, only a few people owned slaves in 19th century America. In the 1860 census, 380,000 people owned slaves in America. There are more people living in Philadelphia at the same time. There are more people living in New York at the same time and Brooklyn at the same time. It's 2% of the population. Now that 2% of the population lives in communities that also support slavery. They vote in political parties that support slavery. They live in a world of many more people who have their back. But there are not that many people who actually own slaves in 1860, and yet they exert disproportionate minority rule and political power over all of America. One example is the Dred Scott decision, the famous Dred Scott decision from 1857 that says African Americans have no rights that white people are obligated to observe or respect, that the Constitution just does not apply. Of the 9 justices who make that decision, 5 are slave owners. 2% of the population own slaves or are enslavers. 5 of the 9 justices are in that same boat. It's disproportionate power. Because of the 3/5 clause, which gives extra appropriation of seats in Congress to places that have slavery, there are 30 extra congressmen in the House of Representatives for Southern states and for the Democratic Party at this point. Which means that when people fight each other, and they physically fight each other frequently in Congress in the 1850s, there's 30 extra guys and 60 extra fists for the side supporting slavery. It just feels more and more as if a minority is imposing on a majority. The largest states in the nation at the time, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Illinois. There's a booming northern population. Places like Philadelphia are exploding in population over places like Virginia or Georgia, and you have a growing northern majority that feels like it's being pushed around and imposed upon. And even when it objects, it feels like it's being attacked. This is a famous picture of the caning of Charles Sumner, 1856. Some of you may know this story. Senator Sumner of Massachusetts makes a speech attacking slavery. He's attacked by a congressman the next day and beaten so badly with a cane that he's blind for quite some time. He never fully recovers. A fellow South Carolina congressman draws a revolver and holds off the rest of the Capitol while his friend beats Charles Sumner. There are 70 incidents like this in the Capitol in these years, 70 violent attacks in the Capitol or on the Hill, on the grounds of the Capitol during these years, attacks on people, most often for criticizing slavery. In American society writ large, and certainly in Philadelphia, you have plenty of violent attacks in this era. There's a culture of something called mobbing, in which some angry group comes after some other angry group. And it doesn't have to be about slavery. Many of these attacks happen targeting Irish Catholic immigrants. This image here is from the 1844 riots in Kensington and in Southwark against Irish immigrants in Philadelphia. But the majority of them are attacking African-American communities and are attacking abolitionist communities. This is the Pennsylvania Hall, which is burnt down in Philadelphia in 1838 by anti-abolitionist mobs. There are 1,200 violent attacks in this era. And again, they're against lots of populations. They're against Irish immigrants, Catholic populations, Mormons, but the biggest bulk of them are targeting people who speak out against slavery. Slavery is not only a force in Georgia and Virginia, it's a force in Philadelphia, it's a force in New York, it's a force in Boston. You can't stand on a street corner in Philadelphia and give a speech against slavery without expecting to be violently attacked. And this growing sense of imposition against free speech, against the ability to speak your mind, especially to this growing northern white majority who feels like they're inheriting the nation, really drives the movement against slavery. As much as people who have humanitarian views think slavery is just an evil thing, there are a lot of people who just feel pushed around, that there's a small population that's claiming control of the government and shutting them up. And that increasingly frustrates people going into the 1860 election, which is going to be this titanic election. And the breaking point is the least expected place. Is anyone here from Hartford, Connecticut? It's the least expected place in America. America's nicest, calmest, dullest city, Hartford, Connecticut. It's America's wealthiest city in 1860, and yet the movement to push back against these impositions of slavery starts in the streets of Hartford. And they're started by this young man, this young man in the middle right here, Edgar S. Jurgensen. Eddie Jurgensen is a 19-year-old kid who works in a textile store in downtown Connecticut, downtown Hartford. He makes $50 a year, which is not much even by 1860 standards. He lives in this store, he boards in this store, he eats in the store, and he washes in the store. He's about as low on the totem pole as you can get. But he wants to get involved in anti-slavery Republican politics. The Republican Party is a brand new party at this point, and its goal is to stop slavery imposing on American life. Again, it's not necessarily to end slavery in Texas, but it's to stop slavery from growing bigger and stronger. And Eddie wants in. And he knows in the beginning of the 1860 election, this is going to be the fight. This is going to be the moment. This is going to be what William Henry Seward called the irrepressible conflict is going to come. This individual over here is Cassius M. Clay. Has anyone ever heard of Cassius Clay? This Cassius Clay. All right, so everybody knows Muhammad Ali, Cassius Clay, but he has a really fitting and amazing namesake in Cassius Marcellus Clay, a 19th century abolitionist from Kentucky who fought and bled and killed for his right to speak out against slavery, for free speech, for being an abolitionist newspaper editor in Kentucky. He's attacked, he's beaten up, he fights people, he kills somebody with his Bowie knife. He's this symbol, especially for Northerners, of kind of a Southern mascot, someone who will stand up and speak out no matter who's coming at him. So Cassius Clay is going to give the kickoff speech in Hartford, Connecticut in February 1860 to get this election going. He's speaking at this hall downtown. Eddie Jurgensen is across the street, kind of hanging out front. And he knows that after Cassius Clay's speech, there's going to be a torchlit march back to Cassius Clay's hotel room. And Eddie wants in. And so he grabs the head off one of the torches, just the metal at top, and puts it in his coat, and sneaks back into the textile shop. And when he opens up his brand new coat, his friends, the other clerks in the textile shop, see that there's an oil stain all over it from the whale oil or the kerosene or whatever that torch was burning. He goes to the waterproof textile area of the store, and he cuts himself about a yard and a half of waterproof textile. And there, I say water, it's proof, really from Philadelphia. He cuts himself this material and makes himself a cape. He sews it, he works in a textile shop, he knows how to do this. And his 5 other buddies, the 5 other clerks, make their own waterproof capes too. They take torches and they put them on curtain rods, so they're like 6 feet tall. And they stand outside in the darkness in February, in the winter in Connecticut. And when Cassius Clay and all the prominent leaders of Republican Connecticut come out of the speech, there are these 5 kids in the darkness with these pseudo-military capes and torches. And they kind of see how this looks dynamic. This looks tough in a way. This looks aggressive. This looks like some movement that's willing to push back against slavery, which just keeps pushing and pushing. And so they put Jurgensen and his buddies in front of this march, and they lead them through the streets of Hartford, Connecticut that night, and they get attacked. They get attacked by local Democrats who hate the Republicans and try to steal their torches. And after a melee, they fight off the Democrats and survive. It seems like a one-off thing to some people, but Eddie Jurgensen and his fellow 19 and 20-year-olds get to talking, and they meet 1 week later to form an organization. They go to one of their friends' apartments, which is above a bank in Hartford. 36 of them, they're young, working-class guys in Connecticut. Many of them are kind of fresh off the farm. Many of them are 19, 20, 21. Voting age is 21 back then, so many of them are too young to vote, and they form an organization. They come up with these capes, like a spiffier version of Eddie Jurgensen's cape, and martial kepis, these caps. They elect captains and lieutenants and form a military structure, and they need a name. And somebody says, why not the Wide Awakes? Which article just that day had said, Republicans wide awake in 1860. And they say, yes, we'll call ourselves the Republican Wide Awakes. There are 3 really interesting aspects of this. First, wide awake is slang in 1850s America for someone it's almost like woke, but not quite. It's Don't get distracted. I shouldn't have said it. Every time I think, should I mention woke or don't mention woke? Either way. Wide awake means to people in the 1850s that you're alert, that you're standing up for yourself, you're paying attention to the problems in society, and usually it applies to small populations. Usually they say like the Mormons are alert in Utah, or Irish Catholic immigrants are alert to discrimination, or something like that. By saying they're wide awake, they're saying we're not going to take it anymore. They use the open eye as a symbol. There's a sense of this thing that's been pushing them around all along, this slave power that keeps asking more and more of the North. They're wide awake to this problem and they're going to push back. But there's also a darker affiliation, because wide awake gangs in the 1850s in Brooklyn, in Boston, up and down the East Coast, had been anti-immigrant, specifically anti-Catholic gangs by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants who are connected to the Know Nothing movement. This is an anti-slavery movement, and yet they're borrowing the name from these nativist anti-Catholic organizations. And many of these members have affiliations. They're all white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, and some of them have affiliations with these kind of know-nothing organizations. So even at the birth of this movement that seems like a group finally standing up for rights against slavery, they have these shady and kind of creepy associations. And I think that's important to remember. These are not the heroes. These are people in history with good and bad views, and I'm not trying to say we should all be wide awakes. So they form this organization, they start spreading throughout Hartford, and their main goal is to act as political bodyguards. There's so many violent attacks on people who speak out against slavery that they want to be the muscle. They're these young guys, they like to fight, they have these uniforms, and they're going to show up to protect speakers. So they show up 1 week later to protect the first speaker who's coming through Hartford, March 5th, 1860. It just happens to be Abe Lincoln. There's no logic to this, but Abe Lincoln is going around New England at the time, giving speeches, kind of getting up momentum for a presidential run. And their first march, their first official duty, is to escort Abe Lincoln through the streets of Hartford. 364 days after they escort Lincoln through Hartford, they march him down Pennsylvania Avenue to his inauguration. So this one random strange group made up of these basically kids and this not very well-known Illinois politician come together and stay together in one way or another. And they kind of bedevil Lincoln for the rest of this campaign because they're not easy to deal with. They start to boom around Connecticut and in New England. People start forming these clubs, getting uniforms, forming wide-awake companies. Young men and women start forming up, joining, and they use this military model. You can see, here's a picture of a wide-awake rally in Mohawk, New York, in upstate New York. They stand to attention, they stand in silence, they stand in a column. They have Major Hardee's tactics for light rifle maneuvers. So they're using actual military tactics for their marches. A usual rally in 19th century America looks more like this. There's a lot of whiskey, there's a lot of cider and beer, there's people shooting revolvers in the air and throwing fireworks, there are kids and dogs and people fighting. It's a muddy mess, basically. And it syncs with a political system that seems pretty chaotic. The wide awakes, on the other hand, seem orderly, dignified, disciplined, even though part of what they're doing is menacing people. Even though they're saying we're here for a fight, they're doing it in this really orderly, stable way. And in a society that feels like their democracy is getting more and more violent every year and is kind of crumbling, when political parties are crumbling and falling apart, the wide awakes are projecting order as their main thing, as their main appeal. And they have another kind of the opposite appeal at the same time. Whenever they lose a fight and there's political violence at these events, they take their injured members and put them up on stage. So in New Haven, they're marching to a rally, and some kids come out and throw bricks at the wide awakes and crack their skulls. And rather than taking them to the hospital or sitting that rally out, they take these 11 injured wide awakes in their capes and put them behind the speaker's rostrum so that they are sitting and bleeding onto their uniforms while the speaker is talking about free speech, about the right to criticize slavery, about the suppression of anti-slavery views. So even their grievance is a motivating tool and appeals to people and gets them to turn out in large numbers. They start to explode. They go to the convention that year. The Republican National Convention is in Chicago. Chicago is a new, boostering city. It really wants to get its name out there. So they form thousands of wide-awake companies, and they tell all the local communities to say, Janesville, Wisconsin, form a wide-awake company. Joliet, Illinois, form a wide-awake company, and they all converge for the rally. conventions bring people together, delegates together. And so the delegates from the Republican Party who go to Chicago and see wide awakes marching in the street and try on wide awake uniforms, then they go back to Westchester, Pennsylvania, or then they go back to Bangor, Maine, and found their own clubs. If you trace in the newspapers, you can see them popping up like vectors and spores, kind of, companies popping up all around the country, so that by the summer of 1860, that wide awake summer, there are hundreds of thousands of companies. We know because they send letters back to the original company with proof, like their ranks and their constitutions and their bylaws. They're getting thousands of these clubs from every northern state into California. They're wide awake clubs in the woods of California, in Folsom, California, Healdsburg, California, really far out there. It's really not quite civilization yet at this point, but they're wide awakes marching around. They're wide awakes in every northern state, but they're especially big where there's trouble. Places that are like rock rib Republican and there's not much political competition, the wide awakes are popular. But places where the wide awakes are fighting Democrats, places like southeastern Pennsylvania or central Illinois or southeastern Wisconsin, where there's a really contested election and open political violence, that's where the wide awakes are biggest. And that's where you see thousands of companies signing up. It's hard to say quite how many wide awakes there are, but they decide that there's 500,000 wide awakes. And every article you read after, say, July 1860, whether pro or con, says there are 500,000 wide awakes in America. I think that number's wrong. I think it's inflated. But if it's true, and it's what is in people's heads, the country has 31 million people in it. So 5 million wide awakes to 31 million people, today it'd be the equivalent of a 5 million person movement. It's huge. We don't have movements that big with membership, with regular participation. It's bigger than probably any of us have seen in our lifetime, this movement, whatever the real size was. And it's extremely diverse. It's mostly young, working class white people in the North, but it has all sorts of other populations joining up. Like I said, they have some associations with nativists, anti-immigrant gangs at first. But as they expand, and especially as they expand into the West, all sorts of immigrant populations sign up. Germans, and Scandinavians, and all sorts of people who were radicals in Europe left during the 1848 revolutions and set up in St. Louis and Cincinnati and Cleveland, join up. So the same movement has know-nothings, who are hostile to immigrants, and brand new, fresh off the boat immigrants. It has radicals who are ready to end slavery tomorrow and invade the South and are absolute abolitionists. And then it has conservatives who aren't interested at all in that. They just want to kind of push back against the impositions of slavery on their life. It even starts to get African-American club members. In Oberlin, Ohio, you get John Mercer Langston, who's later a congressman, founds an African-American wide awake company, and Lewis Hayden, this individual on the right here, is a fugitive slave living in Boston. He escaped slavery in Kentucky. He forms an African-American wide awake company there. On the one hand, it takes incredible bravery to join in a club like this as a black person, to march in the street. Boston is not a city that's welcoming to African-American political participation, and they're marching in military uniforms for Abe Lincoln. And there are people in their own community who are saying, Lincoln's not far enough, he's not an abolitionist, he's not going to support you, and yet this population is trying to turn out and participate. It's a really interesting story. You get a couple female clubs. This is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the famous feminist and suffragist. She forms a female club in Seneca Falls. Throughout kind of upstate New York, you get a couple female clubs. At Mount Holyoke Female Seminary in Massachusetts, you get a female club. So this is a widely diverse movement. And it starts to even spread into the South because there are plenty of people living in what was then the South, which includes Baltimore, D.C., Wheeling, St. Louis. These are then Southern cities. They maintain slavery. They're run by people who think of themselves as Southerners, but they have populations who hate slavery, who feel as if slavery is imposing upon them. And you get wide awakes in D.C. and in Baltimore and in St. Louis, and these populations have to fight all the time. These are the most combative ones. The St. Louis wide awakes get, for their torch staffs, they make sure they have lead cores. So when they use their torches as clubs, they really, pack a wallop. In Baltimore, which they called Mobtown back then, every time the wide awakes march in Baltimore, they have to fight to march. There's open political violence in the streets of D.C., Baltimore, St. Louis, Wheeling, Cincinnati, anywhere that is in the South or adjacent. It's much more contested to be a wide awake. But they're promoting this as a mass movement. There are comic books that tell kids how to join up and be a wide awake. There are song sheets that people sing on the train car about being a wide awake. The most interesting element of this is the relationship between the wide awakes and their political leadership, because the Republican Party doesn't organize the wide awakes. The elite leaders of the party aren't running this movement. The movement's being run by kids who've never voted before, by 19-year-olds, 22-year-olds, and they start just showing up at politicians' houses. They show up at William Henry Seward's house in the middle of the night, in the dark. They light a bonfire among his rose bushes, and he throws open a window and tells them to go back to sleep. Like, he doesn't know how to deal with it, but they keep coming, and they serenade him, and they're 19. They're really excited. They don't necessarily show all their energy and their enthusiasm in the right way, and it's off-putting and kind of threatening to the political leadership. But the better campaigners realize how to play with the wide awakes, and that they have this mass momentum, this large population of kind of moderate working-class white men on their side. It's what the anti-slavery movement lacked for all these years. So they start learning how to play to them and cater to them and joke with the wide awakes. The one guy who really can't do this is Abe Lincoln. This is Abe Lincoln's house. He's the nominee. The nominee is supposed to sit at home and be quiet in 19th century elections. Sometimes people campaign, but they get mocked for it. And Stephen Douglas, one of his rivals, gets campaigns, and people just laugh at him. So Lincoln, who loves people, loves campaigning, loves shaking hands and making jokes, has to sit in his house as wide awakes kind of form around it and cheer him and serenade him and call for speeches. They make him an honorary member. They invite him to his rallies. And he kind of has to sit on his hands the whole election. He writes to a friend, "The taste is in my mouth a little." He wants to be out there campaigning, but it's just considered craven and kind of pathetic for a politician to campaign for their own election at this point. So he has to sit at home. And he's a little skeptical of the wide awakes. There are letters he writes to his friends that summer that say, these big monster rallies, these giant gatherings, they're really fun, but the way you win an election is counting noses. You go into the saloon, you go to the church picnic, and you talk to individuals face to face, and you talk one at a time, win over doubtful voters. That's how you win an election. This marching in the street with torches, Lincoln thinks it's a little juvenile. The peak of the wide awake rallies happened on October 3rd and 4th, 1860, and they're coordinated rallies in New York, Philadelphia, Buffalo, Cleveland, Chicago, Wheeling, St. Louis, Boston, and a lot of other places too. All the way between Bangor, Maine, and St. Cloud, Kansas, there are mass wide awake rallies. There's this gathering at Germantown in a field that's so big, that's probably the biggest gathering in Philadelphia to that point. Wide awakes march in Manhattan and then hop on the train, sleep for 4 hours, and march again in Germantown. So we have kind of the Amtrak commuters of the 19th century who are going to two rallies. And these Pennsylvanians and Philadelphians are really big in the movement and really involved. This is a picture here of Enos Kreisman. He's a Westchester wide awake. Westchester, Pennsylvania had a lot of wide awakes. Paoli had a lot of wide awakes. In Philadelphia, there was big wide awake movement that you could see regularly on the street. And they kind of drag people in. There are these amazing stories of this guy. This is Lucius Crittenden. He's a Vermont Republican who gives a speech in Germantown, and he kind of gets grabbed off the podium and sent on a speaking tour of wide awake rallies in Pennsylvania. And he writes years later, he writes in his memoir, "I should never have trusted myself to those Philadelphia politicians." They basically kidnap him and they make him go speak all over the state, and it's this amazing, grueling account. And then you have really hot-headed people. This is James Sankes Brisbane. He was a prominent Civil War general later. He's a wide awake leader. And what he does is he starts invading the South preemptively. He'll take wide awake marches into Wheeling, which is now in West Virginia, but was then Virginia, into corners of Virginia to march on Southern soil with the wide awakes. He starts writing letters to the governor of Virginia saying, if you ever need us, we can invade your state. Just remember that, and gets in an angry back and forth. Some of these people are moderates and just want to win the election. Others are really hotheads who are preparing for a civil war. And that's one of the most interesting things about this movement. It really runs the gamut. Sometimes it looks like a paramilitary organization getting ready for war, and sometimes it looks like kids just out for fun. You get all these rival political organizations formed up called offsets. Offset clubs, who are anti-wide awake clubs, Southern Democratic offsets, Constitutional Union offsets. It's a four-way race, so there are a lot of different populations who are forming these clubs that kind of steal the wide awake style. In Brooklyn, you get the chloroformers, who are there to put the wide awakes to sleep. I always like that one. And in the South, you get the Minutemen in Charleston, in St. Louis, in New Orleans. And some of these guys are not thinking about winning the election in November. They're thinking about winning the Civil War that they feel like is coming after that. So these offsets are really important, especially one in Washington, D.C. and in Baltimore called the National Volunteers, who say they are there to fight the Wide Awakes if the Wide Awakes come south. And an inquiry into who is a member of the National Volunteers proves that a number of the members are on the Capitol Police, the police force. The same police officers who are defending the Capitol building are also in this partisan political militia. When the election comes, Lincoln wins. We all know that, but it's a strange, close race. He wins 39% of the popular vote in a four-way race, but 59% of the electoral vote. They're just far more Northerners than there are anyone else, and there just isn't an alliance of all the other populations, which would have had a plurality or majority of the vote, to knock out Lincoln. So he wins, and he wins best. This map doesn't quite reflect this, but he wins best in places where the wide awakes are the biggest. He wins more among young people than previous candidates had, and the Republican Party in the previous election proved that it needed to win Pennsylvania, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, California. It needed to win the lower north. And the wide awakes, which are really large in the lower north, and especially popular among young rural people, give him the election. I can't say he won because of the election, but he does best and goes over the top with force of the same population who support the wide awakes. The other thing that happens is the wide awakes color the whole election. Because he's so quiet, because he's so absent and basically stuck in Springfield, whereas the wide awakes are marching through half the communities in America, people associate the Republican Party with the wide awakes and say the wide awakes won. And people in the South who are legitimately afraid of the wide awakes, they don't know that it's mostly a peaceful movement. They're reading all this terrifying news that the wide awakes are going to invade the South. They see this as the opening shot of the Civil War, basically. Almost immediately, people start to secede. South Carolina begins its plans its secession convention right away after Lincoln's election. South Carolina, Georgia, and Louisiana start to arm. They expel federal agents from their states. They expel free blacks from their states. They go on to a war footing already. And as the Deep South secedes, it sends secession commissioners further to the Upper South to convince places like Virginia, Tennessee, Missouri to secede. And many of these commissioners, as they're talking about why they should secede from the Union, point to the wide awakes as the boogeyman. Say, you don't want to stay in this union with these Yankee wide awakes. You can't stay in a nation where there's a partisan paramilitary force running the government. They've already broken the compact among the American people. You have to leave. In the Virginia secession debates, the former governor, Henry Wise, says that the wide awakes are coming to slit our throats and cut us to pieces. He tells Virginians that there's a wide awake naval force and Marines that are going to invade from Norfolk. This is nonsense. This is fake news. This is disinformation. But it's exactly the kind of thing that gets people scared. And a lot of the people, one of the big questions for the Civil War is, why did so many people who didn't want to leave the Union, so many Southerners who were not really interested in secession, willing to support secession when it came? And things like the wide awakes help. They're not the only reason, but they scare an awful lot of people into feeling like they just can't stay in the same nation with these people anymore. On the other end, Lincoln and the Republicans are faced with this incredible dilemma. A civil war is breaking out. States have seceded. They are arming. Weapons are being moved further south. People know that a civil war is coming. And the Republican Party has hundreds of thousands of young men in uniform who've been marching around talking about how willing they are to fight. But if they use this force, what is the risk? What is the positive? What is the negative? Lincoln goes out of his way to tell the wide awakes to go home. Even though there are threats on his life as he goes from Springfield to D.C., even though there's a plot to kill him in Baltimore, he continuously puts it out there that the wide awakes should not escort him. He could have a Praetorian guard of thousands of people to protect him. He gets letters every day from prominent wide awakes saying, we can arm and we can be in D.C. and we can protect you. And he basically tells them to stand down. He says, we're not going to use this force. He sees the threat to scaring away the border states, to upsetting Northern Democrats, to driving away potential allies as worse than the benefit of having the wide awakes, of having this partisan paramilitary force. And so he sends the wide awakes home, essentially. And it's a moment of real bravery because those threats of assassination are real. He is ultimately murdered by somebody from Maryland. So that threat was there all along, and he stood down his bodyguard in a really selfless act to kind of build the largest coalition for union he could. And Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, these states stay in the Union partially because he's very careful about these political aspects. The bloodshed of the Civil War, the real fighting of the Civil War, is directly tied to the Wide Awakes. We all know that the war starts at Fort Sumter. That's where the first shots are fired. But no one is killed at Fort Sumter. The first bloodshed happens in the streets of Baltimore when anti-Wide Awake gangs, led by those national volunteers I mentioned, attack Massachusetts troops as they're marching through town and kill 5 Massachusetts troops. The troops kill 12 civilians. That's the first bloodshed of the Civil War. The second bloodshed of the Civil War happens in St. Louis, where the Wide Awakes have turned into a militia, gotten guns, and basically go capture the local proto-Confederate force. And as they're marching them through St. Louis and people are throwing bricks at them, they open fire on the crowd and kill 30 people. So on either end of the Republic, in Baltimore and in St. Louis, when the war really starts, it's not armies on battlefields with cannons and bayonets. It's people face to face, American citizens with bricks and bottles and rifles, fighting kind of an escalated version of the mobbing and the on-the-street violence that brought the conflict to begin with. And the Wide Awakes are either there fighting or their enemies are there fighting. They're really intimately tied up to the coming of the Civil War. Wide Awakes enlist to fight in huge numbers when the war breaks out. We don't have a total count of the Wide Awakes, so I can't say, but 50% of Northern men of military age go fight in the Civil War. For Wide Awakes, as far as I can tell, it's closer to 3/4 or 8/10. A huge number of people sign up in April, May, June 1861 as the war is breaking out. Full companies enlist together to serve as companies. Captains of Wide Awake companies become captains of volunteer militias. A number of the most prominent speakers to the Wide Awakes become generals, although they're notoriously not the best generals. The most popular Wide Awake speakers, guys like Nathaniel Banks and Carl Schurz and Cassius Clay, they turn out to be pretty miserable generals, but they're really good at giving a speech, so that's half of what you need. But overall, large numbers of Wide Awakes sign up, including Edgar Jurgensen. Most people who are in the Wide Awakes later go fight in the war, as far as we can tell. After the war, the Wide Awakes hold reunions and honor themselves, and they're extremely famous. A large number of people who are in the Wide Awakes go on to basically lead Gilded Age America. If you think about the people who ran late 19th century American life, a lot of them are Union Army vets from New York or Ohio. The guys with beards you see who were presidents in the late 19th century, many of them were Wide Awakes. 5 of the 9 presidents in the rest of that century either were Wide Awakes or spoke to Wide Awake clubs. Secretaries in cabinet positions, senators, congressmen, bank presidents were all Wide Awakes. That's kind of how they got their start. They kind of take over late 19th century life. These same people who were kids marching in the street in 1860 are the leaders in the halls of power in the late 19th century. The best example of that is Edgar Jurgensen himself, who goes on to become America's most famous interior designer. And he redecorates Teddy Roosevelt's house, Thomas Edison's house, and in 1890, he gets a call to come redecorate the White House. The president at the time, Benjamin Harrison, was a Wide Awake in 1860. And his fellow Wide Awake, the founder of the movement who designed the cape and the torch, gives the White House its fancy new drapery and gives it electricity for the first time. So from 1860 to 1890, this guy as a kid and as an adult is kind of using the same skills. From there, people tend to forget about the Wide Awakes. We can maybe talk about why that would be, but they kind of lose popularity and people forget about them. But just a few years ago, somebody contacted the Smithsonian from Milford, New Hampshire. They'd gone up into the attic of an old historical society and discovered under like 100 years of kind of garbage and detritus, George P. Holt's Wide Awake materials. This guy had donated over 100 years ago his Wide Awake cape and his Wide Awake torch. And the cape, he shows all the symbols, including the open eye. We did some testing, some chemical testing, and it used to be bright white with bright purple letters and symbols on it. And his torch, we noticed numbers. He donated to the Smithsonian, that's why I'm saying we. We noticed numbers running along the torch, along the staff here. And it turns out that not only was he a Wide Awake in 1860, but if you look closely, these are the years of presidential elections. 1864, 1868, 1872, 1876, all the way down out of the frame to 1904. So along this torch staff, George P. Holt starts out as a wide awake and participates in the life of American democracy from 1860 to 1904, from Lincoln to Teddy Roosevelt, as kind of a sustained story of engagement in American democracy. The wide awakes kick this story off, and then it just keeps going from there. It kind of defines political life for a generation, and then it mostly recedes. And so most of us haven't ever heard of them. But I think they can tell us something about how the war came, about how Lincoln became the president, and about where the limits are in democracy, where the lines are that are going too far, and what helps kind of mobilize and motivate people who live in a democracy. Thank you.
Hello? Can you guys hear me? No? Let's try that one. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? There we go. Thank you. We have time for a couple of questions. Why don't we start right here in the front? Peter?
Yes, sir.
Fantastic talk, by the way. As you said, it really is the missing piece of the puzzle. So I'm curious about something. These young men were mostly Northerners, which means they didn't grow up in a slave-owning society. People at that time lived and died in the area where they were born. Why did they feel so strongly against slavery? I mean, it's commendable that they did, but why were they so passionate in opposition to slavery when it wasn't really part of their world?
This, to me, is the question that kind of underlines the whole wide awake thing. Why care? Why not just live your life in Hartford? It's not as if what's going on in Georgia directly affects you. I think it's this larger sense. It's the slave power, not slavery itself, not people on plantations in Georgia, but this larger national slave power is imposing upon them and claiming too much and has basically minority rule. And they feel like they are righteously the majority. There's a Yankee majority in the country, and they should be making the decisions. It's almost anti-slavery, not so much for humanitarian reasons, but out of self-interest. We should be running this country, and you're running this country, and that's the frustrating thing, and especially the sense of imposing on free speech. The sense that you can't talk against slavery in the street, you can't give an anti-slavery speech. Anti-slavery presses are being attacked and thrown in rivers all over the kind of the border area. This sense that slavery was okay when it existed where it existed, but that it's imposing on me. I really think that sense of kind of pride and anger at being imposed upon, grievance, is what makes them care, sadly, more than slavery being an evil institution where it already exists. There are people who are diehard abolitionists who join, but I think more it's people who just feel angry that they're being stepped on.
Question in the back, right back there.
Thank you for the great presentation. How many of the European wide awakes were 1848ers or inspired by the revolutions in Europe before they came over here?
It's a great question. There's really a transatlantic moment of kind of nationalist democratic revolutions. A lot of these guys fought in 1848, fought against Germany and Italy and Austria, and basically felt as if the chance of democracy had died in Europe. Those revolutions basically fail. A lot of them moved to St. Louis, to Wisconsin, to Chicago, to kind of mostly German areas of the United States, to Philadelphia, and have a burning sense that democracy is on the decline around the world, and that the last best hope for democracy is the United States, but the threat to democracy in the United States is slavery. And so they start to equate the slave power in the South with the autocracy they saw in Prussia or in Austria, and see a kind of worldwide oppressors they need to fight back again. So they kind of refocus their anger at the Prussian hierarchy towards South Carolina planters or whatever. It becomes a continuum for them. And they go on and they really focus on these revolutionary leaders like Garibaldi in Italy, and Manzini in Italy, Laszlo Kossuth from Hungary. They take the kind of romantic revolutionary culture that is built up in Europe and start to apply it to what's going on in the United States.
Christian, question.
So when you talked about how the wide awakes wanted to protect Lincoln, and he said he didn't want to have it. You know, he's like said, no, we're stand back. What do you think would have happened if they would have protected him before he was assassinated?
It's a good question. So they do mostly go away by 1865 when he's assassinated. Most of them go fight in the war. They're not wide awakes anymore then. But I do wonder what would have happened if he's getting these letters from people saying, I helped organize this movement. I can have 20,000 guys with carbines march you into Washington. And leaders have done that. You think Mussolini did that. You think about people who've had that show of force. Lincoln sees the downside. And he really puts himself at risk. We know those threats of assassination were real. I think it's a moment of incredible bravery on his part and saying, no, the Union and maintaining a broad, moderate fight for union is more important than that the wide awakes have my back. But he gets tons of letters of people saying, you want 5 people in plain clothes? We can have it. You want 50,000 people with rifles? We can have it. There are some people who are really fired up and ready to go. And yeah, who knows? I mean, that could have sparked a bigger fight. If they'd gone with them in 1861, I don't like to speculate, but you could see how it would have scared further states into seceding. You could see people in Maryland, in Kentucky, in Missouri, and Democrats in the North, Democrats in Philadelphia or whatever, saying, this is a partisan war. I don't want any part of this. And without Northern Democrats fighting alongside Northern Republicans, you don't have William Tecumseh Sherman. You don't have Ulysses S. Grant. You could see it breaking the whole coalition apart.
One more question in the very back there, Peter. Thank you.
I'll take your question.
Do you see any parallels between the Wide Awakes and the Proud Boys or other militia movements in the United States today?
Yeah, it's funny. I studied the Wide Awakes for years and I thought I was done. And then 2020 and 2021 made me say, like, I got to tell this story. Because sometimes it felt like I could see parallels to the Proud Boys. And then other times it felt like I could see parallels to Black Lives Matter. It felt like there was a loud public debate going on, it's died down a little, on what you can do in public politically, where the line is between making your point and imposing on other people, scaring other people, calling for violence, and the Wide Awakes are really that story. I learned about the Wide Awakes at the University of Virginia, where I went for grad school, and when the events in Charlottesville in 2017 happened, they marched with tiki torches right by the building I learned about the Wide Awakes, marching with torches many generations before. So it felt like there was a shared conversation going on here about what is acceptable in a democracy, what symbols, what rhetoric, what kind of mobilizing you can do, what is okay and what is crossing that line. And I don't have an answer, but I thought the Wide Awakes were a great way to tease that question out.
Ladies and gentlemen, please thank Jon Grinspan. Thank you very much. I'm sure Jon would be happy to answer 1 or 2 more questions. If you want to purchase a book, he's happy to sign the book as well. Have a great evening. Thank you very much.
So should I go there? That